I still remember the night his words cut into me deeper than any knife, when he looked at me with that cruel smirk and said I was nothing but a foolish girl who thought love was real. And then he laughed so loudly it echoed in my chest, as though my heart itself had cracked. And before I could even understand what was happening, he told me he would never marry someone like me. That I was ugly. That he only wanted to use me. And with those words still burning in my ears, he pushed me away, leaving me out in the dark with nowhere to go. And in that moment, I thought my life was over. But I was wrong, because the story did not end there. Thank you for being here with me and for listening to my story. It truly means more than I can ever say. And before I continue, I would love to know where you are watching from, so please leave a comment and let me know. It helps me feel less alone when I share these pieces of my life. My name is Gloria, and I live in Georgia. And though my voice may sound steady now, when I look back at the girl I once was, I can still feel her pain as if it happened yesterday. At 19, I was a young woman who thought the world was just opening its doors to me. I believed that kindness always returned to you. I believed that love could conquer everything, and I believed that the man who whispered promises in the dark truly meant them. I had no riches, no powerful family name, but I carried within me a heart that wanted nothing more than a home filled with laughter, a hand to hold through the storms, and the kind of life my mother used to tell me I deserved. I thought I had found it in him, because his smile was sharp but charming. His words were smooth as honey, and the way he held me close made me believe I was safe. I was blind to the truth, that sometimes love can wear a mask, and sometimes words that sound like poetry are nothing but lies waiting to collapse. Looking back now, I realize I was not just naive. I was desperate to be loved, desperate to matter. And that desperation made me ignore the shadows already gathering around me. I remember how proud I felt just to stand by his side. How I ignored the way his friends whispered. How I silenced the voice in my chest that told me he looked at me with more arrogance than affection. I told myself that if I gave enough of myself, if I sacrificed and stayed loyal, then he would see me as worthy. But life has a way of teaching lessons the hard way, and mine came at a cost I will never forget. When I think back to those early days, I see a girl who thought love meant sacrifice, who thought giving everything would one day be rewarded with loyalty. And in my heart, I carried this picture of a life where I would be a wife, a partner, someone he would be proud to stand beside. And every time he spoke sweet words, I believed him without question, because I wanted so badly for them to be true. I remember sneaking away to meet him, sitting in the back of his car where he would trace circles on my hand and whisper that I was his only one. And I remember the way my chest swelled with happiness just hearing it. Not realizing those words were empty. Not realizing I was building my dreams on sand that could not hold the weight of real life. I was so blinded by what I thought was love that I overlooked how he never introduced me proudly to his parents, how he never walked beside me in public with the same warmth he showed in private, how his eyes sometimes carried a coldness I pretended not to see. Because in my youth I confused attention with devotion and I mistook possession for affection. When I discovered I was expecting, I remember holding my breath with a strange mix of fear and joy, because I thought this was the moment that would change everything, that he would finally see me as permanent in his life, that he would no longer hide me, that he would stand with me and build the family I had always longed for. I practiced in my head how I would tell him. I even smiled thinking of his reaction, imagining him holding me close and saying that he was ready to take the next step. But the day I shared the truth with trembling lips, the ground beneath me cracked in a way I will never forget, because instead of joy, his mouth curled into a cruel grin. And instead of love, I saw mockery. And instead of pulling me close, he pushed me away in front of others, making my secret into a weapon against me. His words were loud and sharp, and they cut into me deeper than any blade, telling me that I was foolish to ever think he would make me his wife, calling me ugly and unworthy, telling me that all he ever wanted was to use me and nothing more. I still hear the echo of that laughter, not soft or private, but loud enough for his friends to hear. Loud enough to pierce through me, as though my very soul had been torn apart. And when I turned my eyes to his parents, hoping for some ounce of compassion, I saw only silence. The kind of silence that tells you your pain is not even worth defending. I was left standing there with my heart shattered, my dignity stripped, and the dreams I had carried collapsing in front of me. That night, when I walked away with tears streaming down my face, I realized I had nothing. No home to go to, no comfort to lean on, just the weight of a new life inside me, and the crushing feeling that I had been abandoned before I even began. The girl I was that night would never come back, because in one single evening, innocence was replaced with sorrow, trust was replaced with bitterness, and hope was buried under the rubble of his betrayal. Yet even as I stumbled forward in the darkness of that rejection, somewhere deep within me, a tiny seed of strength was planted. One I did not know would one day grow into something far greater than anything he could ever take away. In the days that followed, I felt as though I was walking through a storm with no shelter, every step heavier than the last, and every corner of the town seemed to carry whispers about me. Whispers I could not escape, no matter how far I walked. People looked at me differently, some with pity, some with judgment, and some with cruel amusement, as if my pain was entertainment for them, as if the shame he threw on me was mine to carry alone. I would lie awake at night on the small mattress I managed to find in a rented room that barely had space for me, staring at the cracked ceiling and wondering how I could have been so blind, how I could have believed in a love that had no foundation, how I could have given my heart to someone who saw me as nothing more than a joke. My tears felt endless, soaking into the pillow until I thought there would be no water left in me to cry. But somehow, each morning brought a new wave of grief that refused to dry out. I remember trying to hold my head high in the daylight, pretending to be stronger than I was, pretending I could ignore the coldness of those around me, but inside, I was breaking piece by piece, because everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and family had been ripped away in the cruelest way. There were moments I wanted to run back and beg for a different ending. Moments when I thought, perhaps if I pleaded harder or cried louder, he might change his mind. But even in the middle of that despair, a quiet voice whispered that his cruelty was final, that begging would not soften a heart that never cared to begin with. That realization left me hollow, but it also began to carve something new inside me. Something I could not yet name. A resilience that came not from pride but from sheer necessity, because I had no one to rescue me, no hand to pull me back up, only the weight of survival pressing against my chest and forcing me to find a way forward. The cold nights stretched endlessly, and I would listen to the sound of footsteps outside my window, wishing someone would stop and knock, wishing someone would tell me I was not alone, but the world stayed silent. And in that silence, I learned the harsh truth that not everyone you love will stand with you. Not everyone you trust will fight for you. And sometimes the people you believed in most will watch you drown without reaching for the rope. That truth was bitter, but it hardened me in ways I could not see at the time. And though I was broken, though I was humiliated, though I felt discarded like a piece of trash, there was still a spark inside me that refused to go out. I would whisper to myself late at night, clutching my stomach with shaking hands, promising that I would survive this, that I would find a way, and that I would never again let anyone decide my worth for me. That promise was the only light I carried in those dark days, and it became the foundation for the strength I would one day discover, a strength I never imagined I could possess. The nights turned into weeks and the weeks into months, and each day I carried myself forward with a body that felt tired but a mind that refused to collapse completely. Because even though I had been left with nothing, I knew that nothing could not be the end of me. I began to take whatever work I could find, scrubbing floors until my knees ached, washing dishes until my hands were raw, and standing for hours in places where no one even looked me in the eye. Yet every coin I earned was proof that I was still standing, proof that he had not broken me in the way he wanted. There were days when the hunger was sharper than the pain of his words, when the emptiness in my stomach seemed to echo louder than the silence of my room. But even then, I whispered to myself that I would not give up, that I would fight through it, because the alternative was to surrender. and I had already surrendered once when I believed in him. I would not do it again. Sometimes I would walk past the places we once met, and my heart would twist as if it wanted to pull me back into the memory of who I had been. But I forced myself to keep moving, reminding myself that I had been blinded then, that the girl who laughed in his arms was gone, and that the woman who took her place would not be so easily fooled. I learned to ignore the stares. I learned to quiet the doubts, and slowly I began to piece together a version of life that was my own. Fragile, but mine. Built with sweat, with tears, and with a determination that surprised even me. And though there were moments I wanted to collapse, moments when the loneliness was so sharp it cut through me like glass, I found that every time I thought I had reached my limit, something inside of me pushed me one step further. It was in those endless shifts and weary nights that I began to understand that pain could either drown you or drive you, and I chose to let it drive me. Each insult I remembered became fuel, each cruel laugh became a reminder, and every silence from those who should have defended me became a lesson that the only voice I could rely on was my own. I still felt the sting of betrayal, and I still carried the shame of being cast aside, but slowly I was building something far stronger than the girl who had been left in the dark. I was building endurance, I was building courage, and though the road was long and filled with hardship, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I was capable of far more than he had ever imagined. Through those long years of struggle, as I pushed through one day after another, there came small rays of light that reminded me I was not entirely invisible. And though the world had seemed cruel and silent when I was cast out, a few kind souls crossed my path and helped me believe that compassion still existed. There was an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down from my small room, and every now and then she would slip me a loaf of bread or a jar of soup, not with pity, but with quiet understanding. And in those moments I felt seen in a way that soothed the ache inside me. There was also a coworker at the diner where I scrubbed plates who once pressed a pair of gloves into my hands when she noticed how raw my skin had become, saying only, "You'll need these more than me." And it struck me that even in the midst of hardship, there were people who carried kindness in their bones. These gestures were not grand. They did not erase the weight of my burden, but they stitched together fragments of hope in my heart, and they reminded me that even the smallest act could give me the strength to keep going. I realized then that allies do not always come in the form of those closest to you. Sometimes they are strangers who appear for a brief season, leaving behind encouragement that lingers long after they are gone. Their kindness did not lift the responsibility from my shoulders, but it steadied me. It gave me the courage to keep building a life with what little I had, and it reminded me that survival was not meant to be carried entirely alone. I began to tell myself that strength was not only in how much pain I could endure, but also in how willing I was to accept the hand of someone who offered it with sincerity. And as the years went on, while I poured every ounce of myself into working, into learning, into creating some stability, I discovered that those small acts of kindness had planted something inside me that grew quietly with time. They made me more determined, more disciplined, more unwilling to quit, because I wanted to honor the help I had received by building a life that was not marked by defeat, but by resilience. Every smile from a stranger, every word of encouragement from someone who saw my effort, became fuel that I used to shape my tomorrow. And slowly, I began to notice that I was no longer just surviving. I was fighting towards something greater, something that would one day stand as proof that his rejection did not end me, but instead forced me to become stronger than he could have ever imagined. With time, I began to understand that the promises I whispered to myself in the darkest nights were no longer just words of comfort. They were becoming the very foundation of the life I was determined to build. And every sacrifice I made became a brick in the wall that protected me from the despair he wanted me to drown in. I still remember the first real turning point, when I held my newborn in my arms and felt both the weight of responsibility and the spark of strength I did not know lived inside me. And as I looked into those small eyes, I whispered that I would never allow him to feel the emptiness I had been left with, that no matter how hard it became, he would know love, stability, and respect. That promise became my anchor, and it guided me through days when my body ached from endless work, through nights when sleep was nothing more than a luxury I could not afford, and through moments when despair tried to pull me back into its grip. There were mornings when I left for work before the sun rose, and nights when I returned long after it had disappeared, too tired to even eat. Yet I kept moving because the thought of giving up was far heavier than the weight of exhaustion. I taught myself to stand firm even when my knees shook. I learned to keep my voice steady even when fear clawed at my throat. And I realized that courage is not the absence of pain, but the choice to keep walking despite it. With each passing year, I could see the fruits of my determination slowly growing, not in riches or luxury, but in the quiet dignity of paying my bills on time, of keeping food on the table, of proving to myself that I was not defined by the cruelty of one man's words. And as I watched my son begin to grow, I felt the faintest sense of victory stirring within me, because every smile on his face, every small achievement, every moment of joy he experienced was proof that I had not failed, proof that I was stronger than the rejection that once tried to bury me. The turning point was not a single day or a single decision. It was the steady climb out of the hole I had been pushed into, one step at a time, one sacrifice at a time, one quiet prayer at a time. And though my hands were often trembling, though my breath was sometimes heavy with fatigue, I never allowed myself to forget that I was building a life not just for myself, but for him. And that thought alone carried me further than I ever thought I could go. As the years stretched on, the climb I once thought impossible began to show its reward, and the pieces of my life that had been scattered started to form into something steady, something I could stand on without fear of it collapsing beneath me. I moved from one job to another, each time learning more, each time proving that I was not the helpless girl he once laughed at, until eventually I found myself working at the bank, starting at the lowest desk, counting coins and filing papers, and slowly rising through discipline, effort, and the kind of determination that no one could ignore. Every promotion felt like a quiet victory, every new responsibility a reminder that my worth was never his to decide, and I carried myself with a pride that came not from vanity, but from survival. There were still struggles, of course, because life never became easy, but there was a difference now. I was no longer desperate, I was no longer lost, I was no longer the girl who believed that love had to hurt in order to be real. Instead, I became a woman who knew the value of her labor, who understood the strength of her own back, and who finally saw her reflection not as something unworthy, but as someone who had endured and risen. The whispers of society no longer pierced me. The memories of his laughter no longer silenced me, because every time I walked into that bank, every time I signed my name with authority, I knew I had rewritten the story he once tried to force upon me. And as my son grew into a young man full of promise, full of respect, full of the kind of character that comes only from watching sacrifice and learning dignity, I saw in him the living proof of everything I had fought for. He carried himself with kindness, he worked hard in school, and he never once showed the arrogance his father had wielded like a weapon. And that gave me peace in a way nothing else could. I realized then that I had not only rebuilt my life, I had built a future that shined brighter than the one I had once dreamed of. A future not tied to anyone's approval, but one crafted with my own hands, one forged in the fire of betrayal and shaped by resilience. And though I carried the scars of my past, I began to understand that scars are not signs of weakness, but proof of survival. And mine told a story of a woman who had been discarded but never destroyed. The more my life settled into something solid, the more I began to notice how the years had shaped not only me, but also the young man I had raised, because every hardship I had endured, every sacrifice I had made, had not gone unseen, and in his eyes I saw the reflection of the strength he had learned from watching me. He grew into someone I could be proud of, respectful, determined, carrying a quiet dignity that reminded me that my pain had not been wasted, that something beautiful had grown from the soil of my suffering. There were nights when I sat alone at the kitchen table, sipping tea and thinking about how different his life would have been if I had given up, if I had chosen despair over endurance. And those thoughts made me realize that resilience does not just change your own story, it shapes the generations that follow. I often thought back to the man who had once thrown me aside, the one who declared I was unworthy of his love, and I would imagine what he might say if he could see what I had built, if he could see the strong young man I had raised without him, if he could see me walking through the bank in clothes I had bought with my own earnings, carrying the authority of someone who had clawed her way out of nothing and claimed her own name again. And though the memory of his cruelty still stung, I began to notice that it no longer controlled me. Because every time I thought of him now, I did not feel the hollow ache of loss. I felt the solid weight of triumph, the quiet joy of knowing that I had survived everything he intended to destroy me with. It was in those moments of reflection that I began to truly understand the depth of what I had accomplished. Because I had not only proven him wrong, I had proven myself right. I had proven that the promise I whispered on nights when the world seemed against me was not just empty words, it was the foundation of a reality I now lived. And as I looked toward the future, watching my son step into his own life with courage and ambition, I realized that the past could no longer chain me. It could only remind me of how far I had come. And that thought alone gave me peace in a way I had never known before. Then one afternoon, as life had begun to feel steady and the years of struggle seemed far behind me, the past returned in a way I never expected. Because as I sat at my desk in the bank where I now held the position of manager, reviewing papers with the quiet confidence that comes from building yourself from nothing, a familiar voice caught my ear. A voice that once made my heart tremble with both hope and fear. And when I lifted my eyes, I saw him standing there. Time had not been gentle to him. His hair had thinned. His face was heavier. His shoulders slouched under the weight of years that had clearly not gone as he had imagined. And there was no trace of the arrogance he once wore like a crown. Only the desperation of a man who had lost far more than he had gained. He did not recognize me at first, and in that moment I was strangely grateful, because it gave me the chance to study him without being seen, to compare the man before me with the boy who had mocked me all those years ago, and I realized that life itself had delivered him the punishment I once thought I would never see. He stepped forward nervously, carrying papers in his hand, asking for a loan to save a failing business. His tone coated in politeness, but edged with fear, and as I listened I felt an almost surreal calm wash over me, because here he was, standing across from the woman he once threw away, unaware that the fate of his future now rested in my hands. My heart did not race with anger, nor did my body shake with resentment. Instead, I felt something deeper, a quiet sense of justice, as if the years had been preparing me for this exact moment. A moment not of revenge but of revelation. I let him speak. I let him try to explain his need, and when his eyes finally met mine, recognition flickered slowly, spreading across his face until the color drained from it completely. And for the first time in my life, I saw fear in him, not because of anything I said, but because of what he remembered doing to me. I leaned forward, keeping my voice steady, my expression calm, and I slid the file back across the desk, telling him softly that without collateral or a reliable partner there was nothing I could do. And then I paused, letting my words sink in before adding, or perhaps a wife who could stand with you. His face turned pale, his lips parted as though he wanted to argue, but no words came, and in that silence I saw the truth he had tried to bury, that he had mocked the very woman who now held power over him. It was in that moment that I understood what true strength felt like, not in shouting, not in revenge, but in sitting tall, speaking calmly, and knowing that the one who once tried to break me could never again touch the life I had built. He sat there frozen, his hands twitching as though they wanted to grip something solid, but finding nothing, and the silence between us stretched heavy, filled not with the power he once wielded, but with the weight of everything he had thrown away. And I could see the shame flicker in his eyes, even as he tried to mask it with a weak smile. He stammered a few words, reaching for excuses, talking about bad luck, about partners who betrayed him, about circumstances that weren't his fault, but every sentence only revealed more of the man he had become, a man who had spent his life blaming others instead of facing the consequences of his own cruelty. I listened quietly, not because I cared for his explanations, but because I wanted him to hear his own voice. I wanted him to realize that there was no mask left to hide behind, and that the girl he once mocked was no longer standing broken before him, but sitting across the desk with dignity he could not touch. The longer he spoke, the more desperate he became, his arrogance crumbling with each passing moment, and when he finally stopped, searching my face for pity, I gave him none, because I had no pity left for a man who had chosen laughter over love, rejection over responsibility, and cruelty over compassion. I told him with calm certainty that the loan would not be possible, and I watched as those words sank into him the way his words once sank into me, leaving him smaller, weaker, and powerless. He shifted in his chair, his shoulders slumped, and his eyes darted around the room as though searching for someone else to save him. But there was no one, only me. And I was not the naive girl of 19 anymore. I was a woman who had learned the value of silence, the power of self-respect, and the strength that comes from surviving the very storm meant to destroy you. As he stood to leave, his papers shaking in his hands, I felt no anger, no triumph, no bitterness, only peace. Because I understood in that moment that life itself had carried out the justice I once prayed for. He walked out of the bank slower than he had entered, and though he tried to hold his head high, I could see in every step that he was haunted, not by me, but by the choices that had led him there. And as I watched him disappear through those glass doors, I knew with absolute certainty that the tables had turned forever, that the man who once laughed at my pain would live the rest of his life, knowing he had lost the only thing that could never be bought back: respect. When the doors closed behind him, and the sound of his footsteps faded away, I sat there for a long moment, letting the silence wrap around me. Not the silence of abandonment I had once known, but the silence of victory. The kind that speaks louder than any scream or insult could ever manage. I thought back to that night when he threw me out, when I stood trembling with nowhere to go and nothing to hold on to but my own tears. And I compared it to the woman I was now, steady, unbroken, and holding the authority he could never steal from me. The contrast was so sharp that it brought a rush of emotion through me, not anger and not revenge, but a profound sense of freedom, as if the chains that had clung to me for 20 years had finally fallen away. I did not need him to beg, I did not need him to apologize, because I realized that the greatest justice was not found in hearing his regret, but in living my life so fully that his rejection no longer mattered. Every insult he once hurled at me, every cruel laugh, every silent judgment from his family, all of it had been washed away by the years of hard work, by the nights I endured when no one stood beside me, and by the pride I carried for raising a son who was everything his father was not. In that moment, I understood that true power is not in crushing your enemies, it is in thriving so completely that they can no longer touch you, in rising so high that their attempts to belittle you seem meaningless in the shadow of your growth. As I leaned back in my chair, I whispered to myself that I was no longer the girl defined by what had been done to her. I was a woman defined by what she had built, by the dignity she had preserved, and by the strength that had carried her when the world wanted her to fall. And though the scars of my past would always remain, I now saw them not as marks of shame, but as reminders that I had survived, that I had endured, and that I had transformed my suffering into a life no one could take from me. That day, as I locked away the file he had left behind, I locked away the last trace of his hold over me, and I walked forward with a heart that was finally free. As I left the office that evening, the sun was setting in warm shades of gold, and I felt a calmness within me that I had never known before. A calmness born not from what I had gained, but from what I had overcome. I walked through the streets with my head held high, no longer carrying the weight of his cruelty, no longer bound by the memories of his laughter. Because I finally understood that his rejection had not destroyed me, it had shaped me into the woman I had become. I had survived the nights of hunger, I had survived the stares of judgment, and I had survived the silence of those who should have defended me. And now I stood with dignity, proof that strength is not always loud but always lasting. That day taught me that sometimes the sweetest justice is not to fight back with anger, but to live so fully that your very existence becomes the answer to every insult. And as I closed my eyes, I whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude for the journey, painful as it had been, because it had carried me to a place of peace. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of my story. Your time and your presence mean more than I can ever put into words. And if my journey has touched you in any way, I invite you to subscribe, to join me again, and to share your own strength, because none of us are truly alone when we walk together through stories like these.